Page 409 continued. Poetry. William Cullen, Cullen, Bryant, Bryant, expressed the unity of past and present, of America and Europe in his poetry. His first poem, The Embargo, or The Sketches of the Times, Cologne, a satire, 1808, was published as the work of an anonymous, quote, youth of 13, unquote, stop. Thanatopsis, Thanatopsis, shows the influence of Wordsworth. The Yellow Violent and the Inscription for the Entrance to a Wood are nature poems. The Yellow Violent and the Inscription for the Entrance to a Wood are nature poems in which nature is, quote, the abode of gladness, unquote, where, quote, the birds sing and sport in wantonness of spirit, unquote, stop. His 8 poems, including Thanatopsis, were published in a slender collection entitled Poems 1821. His famous poems are To the Fringed Gentian, Song of Marianne's Men, O Mother of a Mighty Race, Robert Lincoln. The Planting of the Apple Tree and the Death of Lincoln, quote, Bryant was also a pioneer in American literary criticism. He was our earliest systematic study of nature poetry, unquote, stop. Paulding, Paulding, and Nathaniel Parker Willis, the 2 poets of this period, made little contribution to American poetry. Para. Ralph Waldo Emerson, an original thinker, philosopher, orator, poet, and author, quote, became known throughout the nation as the Sage of Concord, unquote, stop. Henry Bamford Parks, Henry Bamford, Bamford, Parks, Parkes, writes about Emerson's greatness, quote, but Emerson was greater than his philosophy, stop. His writings were filled with acute observations of contemporary men and institutions and insights into human psychology, stop. As a critic of the American life of his time, he was always shrewd and often profound, stop. And he could express his ideas with a pungency and a poetic vividness which made him one of the great paraphrase makers of literature, unquote, stop. Para. Emerson's works include journals which contain his first significant writing, constitute a full record of his development, and afford an intimate view of his life. Nature, which expresses the fundamental concepts of transcendentalism and anticipates later works such as Over Soul, The American Scholar, and the Divinity School Address, 1838, expresses his disregard for authority and his concern for the individual. Essays First Series, 1841, consists of some of his finest essays: Self-Reliance, Over Soul Compensation, Spiritual Laws, Love, Friendship, and History. Para. Representative Men advances these ideas further and illustrates Emerson's concept of greatness through a study of 6 men: Plato the philosopher, Swedenborg, Swedonberg, the mystic, Montaigne, Montaigne, the skeptic, Shakespeare the poet, Napoleon the man of the world, and Goethe the writer. According to Emerson, the greatest man of all, except Jesus Christ, was Plato, because he was both philosopher and poet. A great man has more divinity in him and thus conveys to mankind a sense of its own potentialities. Para. Emerson's prose, especially his public lectures and 2 volumes of essays, were instrumental to the propagation of his ideas. A Puritan and transcendentalist, he devoted himself to the task of intellectual exploration. He was an individualist who stressed on the reform of the individual self. Although he sympathized with the movements of social reform, he did not join them. He did not have too much faith in institutional changes. Commenting on the literary worth of Emerson's prose, Henry Bamford Parkes writes, page 410, quote, "But Emerson was greater than his philosophy." Stop. His writings were filled with acute observations of contemporary men and institutions and insight into human psychology. Stop. As a critic of American life, he could express his ideas with a pungency and poetic vividness which made him one of the great phrase-makers of the world. Stop unquote. Para. Emerson was a mystic poet. His poems were collected in 2 volumes entitled Poems 1847 and May Day and Other Pieces 1876. Some of his famous poems are the Rhodora, R-H-O-D-O-R-A, comma, Each and All, comma, The Problems, comma, The Snowstorm, comma, Hamtreya, H-A-M-T-R-E-Y-A, and Earth Song. Stop. Santayana, in his Essays in Literary Criticism, observed that Emerson's, quote, religion was all poetry, comma, a poet whose only pleasure was thought, ... Stop. His inmost impersonal spirit ranged abroad over the fields of history and nature, comma, gathering what ideas it might, comma, and singing its little snatches of inspired song, stop unquote. The main themes of his poetry are nature, patriotism or nationalism, personal or domestic life, and reflective or philosophical. Para. Emerson, like Thoreau, Thoreau, and other transcendentalists, was influenced by the concept of, quote, selfhood, unquote, and found in Hindu scripture a well-elaborated doctrine of self. He knew laws of Manu, comma, Vishnu Purana, comma, the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. In Plato, the philosopher, he writes that, quote, the conception of fundamental unity, unquote, dash, the, quote, ecstasy, unquote, of losing, quote, all being in one being, unquote, dash, finds its highest expression, quote, chiefly in the Indian scriptures, comma, in the Vedas, stop, the Bhagavad Gita and the Vishnu Purana. Emerson's poetry echoes Vedanta in form as well as in content. His famous poem Brahma evinces the influence of Katha Upanishad and the Gita, for example, quote, if the red slayer think he slays, or if the slain think he is slain, stop. They know not the subtle ways. I keep, comma, and pass, comma, and turn again, stop, unquote, para. Henry David Thoreau, a third-generation American, was a close disciple of Emerson. He was a native resident of Concord, Massachusetts, home of Emerson in his mature years and center of transcendentalists. From 1841 to 1843, he stayed with Emerson. In 1845, he decided to leave alone for away from the trappings of civilization. He lived in a simple hut on the bank of Concord. He lived like an Indian yogi. Thoreau was well versed with Greek literature, Elizabethan literature, German literature, and Indian classics, which attracted him most. Para. Thoreau found in Hindu scriptures a way of life with which he felt a profound affinity. The Upanishads, the Gita, Manusmriti, and other Hindu scriptures influenced him. He was also interested in yoga. When Thoreau died of tuberculosis at the age of 45, he was unknown as a writer. He remained in obscurity for about 50 years after his death, but in 1962, the celebration of the 100th anniversary of his death was an international literary event. Para. Thoreau's works are journals 1837 to 1861, which contain his earliest writing and the fullest record of his thought. The journals contain his observations on nature, reflections on himself, appreciations and comments on books, and criticism of society and man's place in it. Para. A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers is based on a trip on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers in the company of his brother John. Walden, W-A-L-D-E-N, or The Life in the Woods, 1854, is based on his life at Walden Pond from July 4, 1845 to September 1847. It consists of 18 thoughtful essays on various topics. Civil Disobedience, a famous essay published as a pamphlet, expresses the principle of passive resistance and the moral superiority of individual conscience to governmental law. He defied the government and refused to pay taxes. Mahatma Gandhi was highly influenced by Thoreau's essays, Civil Disobedience. It contains two famous statements. Quote, "The government is best which governs the least," unquote, and, quote, "No taxation without representation," unquote, stop. Thoreau wrote essays and made speeches which advocate the elimination of slavery and the tyranny of the government over the individual. Some of his essays are notable pieces of prose. A Plea for Captain John Brown, 1859, is a powerful speech in defense of the famous abolitionist John Brown. It contains one of the best statements of Thoreau's political attitude. Quote, "The only government I recognize is the power which establishes justice in the land, comma, never that which establishes injustice," stop, unquote. Life without principle or getting a living was originally a speech delivered in 1854, which was published in a magazine 10 years later. His posthumously published works are Excursions, 1863, The Maine Woods, Maine, 1864, Cape Cod, 1865, and Ayankee, Ayankee, in Canada, 1866. Para. Thoreau's poems were published posthumously. Some of his poems had appeared in magazines, including The Dial in the early 1840s. Page 411. Emerson discouraged Thoreau from composing poems. He was a poet by temperament. He loved poetry. He once wrote, quote, "My life has been the poem I would have writ, W-R-I-T, comma, but I could not both live and utter it," stop, unquote. Para. He composed poems on nature as "The river swelleth more and more," and "The inward mourning." His verse, like that of Emerson, was faulty. He abundantly uses conceits and mannerisms. Para. Thoreau was a profound thinker and a genuine analyst of society. He was one of the, quote, "masterful stylists in American literature, comma, notable for his descriptive ability, comma, his command over epigrammatic statement, comma, his use of symbolic analogy, and his sense of language, stop unquote. Para. Walt Whitman, 1819 to 1892, was influenced by Jacksonian democracy and Locofoco, LOCO-FOCO movement. It was the democracy for the common people, quote, the planter, the farmer, the mechanic, and the laborer, unquote, stop. The extremists among Jacksonians were known as Locofoco. He was the poet of America and championed the cause of democracy and equality. He believed, as he forcefully expressed in Democratic Vistas, that, quote, the true gravitation hold of liberalism in the United States will be a more universal ownership of property, unquote, and that the national welfare depended mainly on, quote, the safety and endurance of the aggregate of its middling property owners, stop unquote. As editor of Brooklyn Eagle and in other journalistic positions, Whitman was a crusader of these ideas, stop unquote. In his early 30s, he experienced some kind of emotional transformation which caused him to see democracy not merely as political program but also as a spiritual faith. He cultivated a mystical view of life. All inhabitants in the world were emanations of divinity. Man must strive to attain unity with God. The writings of Emerson and Indian scriptures immensely influenced him. Para. Leaves of Grass, which was subsequently revised and enlarged, ran into many editions. The first edition contained a preface and 12 untitled poems. Its second edition, containing 32 poems, appeared in 1856. Emerson found Leaves of Grass, quote, the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed, stop unquote. The third edition, 1860, contained 124 new poems and the old one extensively revised and with new titles. 8 new poems were added to its fourth edition, 1867. The fifth edition, 1871-1872, included Passage to India. The seventh edition of Leaves of Grass, 1881, contains poems in their final arrangement. The eighth edition appeared in 1888, and the ninth edition, known as the Deathbed edition, appeared in 1892. Poems written after 1881 were added in appendices. Drum Taps and Sequel to Drum Taps, 1865, are 2 poetical pamphlets about Civil War and President Lincoln. The poems in this volume reveal a pessimistic mood. The famous elegy, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, contains a profound treatment of death. Democratic Vistas, 1871, are prose essays on democracy and personalism. Specimen Days and Collect, 1882-83, is a prose volume containing his reminiscences, personal notes, and records. November Boughs, Boughs, 1888, contain poems of reminiscences in the November of the poet's life. Para. Whitman is regarded as, quote, the culminating figure in the literary development, unquote, of the 19th century. Hawthorne and Melville had negated the affirmative qualities of transcendentalism espoused by Emerson and Thoreau. Whitman's poetry is the celebration, quote, of the positive, but with a keener awareness of what was lacking in the individualist ideal and what was needed for its consummation, stop unquote. The Leaves of Grass, influenced by Indian Vedantic thought, is the affirmation of his faith in, quote, the sacredness of man, unquote. For example, quote, I celebrate myself, and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume. Stop. For every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Stop, unquote, para. Whitman was a poet of America and democracy. Richard Chase rightly remarks that he was a national poet, quote, the poet of American optimism and pragmatism, comma, the rhapsodist of our material and spiritual resources, comma, the unabashed celebrant of the self at home in an open, comma, dynamic universe, unquote, stop. To him, democracy was a form of society which would allow the fullest and freest development for each man's self, would bring out each man's divinity. Individual, Whitman thought, was at the center of a democratic civilization. Democracy is a way of life and a manifestation of highest social and civilizational values. So Whitman's celebration of self was a celebration of his fellow man and of the people at large. Quote, one's self I sing, comma, a simple separate person, comma. You utter the word democratic, comma, the word mass, M-A-S-S-E, stop, E-M capital. Walt Whitman's, unquote, para. Walt Whitman's poetic craftsmanship is unconventional and innovative. His magnum opus, The Leaves of Grass, page 412, was written not in conventional metric form but in a free verse, derived mainly from the Bible. He called The Leaves of Grass a, quote, language experiment, unquote, stop. His preface to Leaves of Grass is a literary manifestation like Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads. The poet, according to Whitman, conceals, quote, his rhythm and uniformity, and the roots of his verse, comma, but to break forth loosely as lilacs on a bush and takes shapes compact, comma, as the shapes of melons or chestnuts or pears, unquote, stop. His diction, too, is experimental and innovative. Emerson described Whitman's vocabulary as a, quote, remarkable mixture of the Bhagavad Gita and the New York Herald, unquote, stop. His vocabulary reflects his passionate intensity and ringing sincerity. He packs his verse with vivid pictures of innumerable objects. Para. Whitman is an original poet. Rabindranath Tagore once observed, quote, Whitman is the highest name, stop. In poetry, one must have originality and spontaneity and that breadth of thought which tells you that the poet has seen deeply and knows humanity, stop. Whitman gives me pictures, stop, unquote, para. It was in his role as a technical innovator that Whitman influenced American poetry most. His influence is noticeable in the works of Lindsay and Sandberg. The new poetry of the second decade of the 20th century in America owed a great deal to Whitman. He is the father of free verse movement. Para. Emily Dickinson, 1830 to 1886 too, is an original poet. Although she was influenced by the transcendentalism of Emerson and Thoreau, the hymns of New England churches, especially the hymns of Isaac Watt, W-A-T-T, semicolon. The metaphysical poets of England, in her wheat and her elliptical metaphors, her poetry has a forward-looking quality because she has a close affinity with the poets of the 20th century in her detail, her imagism, her use of half-rhymes and dissonant dissonant, I think printing mistake, qualities. She did not belong to any school of poetry. She had no master and no disciple. Her poetry reflects a life which she lived in, quote, extreme individuality, unquote, stop. She never married, lived at home all her life, much of the time within her family circle. Quote, but her significant life was interior, unquote, stop, as her poems indicate. Para. Dickinson's poems number about 1800, many of which she left in complete form. She made little effort to publish her poems in her lifetime. Some volumes of her poetry appeared in 1890. Finally, Thomas A. Johnson edited a complete edition of her poems in 1955. He also edited her letter under the title The Complete Letters of Emily Dickinson. Para. Emily Dickinson was a skilled poetic craftsman. She was able to give concrete expression to abstract ideas. Her images are precise, pointed, highly expressive of theme and feeling, and effective. Nature, love, death, and immortality are the recurrent themes in her poetry. Emily Dickinson packed her verse with intense meaning. She breaks loose from all conventional forms of expression. Her violation of the rules of grammar and syntax and her ruthless omission of words have enabled her to capture the spontaneity and excitement of her thoughts. Para. Henry Wordsworth Longfellow, Longfellow, 1807 to 1882, was one of the most popular poets of the 19th century. He was a singer of nationalism, and he urged the younger generation to build a national literature. His literary career began with the articles on European literature, which appeared in North American Review. Outre, O-U-T-R-E-M-E-R, Mer, is an account of his travel. Hyperion is a prose romance. His poems have been collected in many volumes. Voice in the Night, Ballads and Other Poems, Poems, The Belfry of Burgess and Other Poems, Evangeline, The Seaside and the Fireside, The Song of Hiawatha, Hiawatha, and The Courtship of Miles Standish and Other Poems. Para. He was a romantic at heart. His poems reflect the picturesqueness of Old World. He enjoys the honor of awakening the Americans' interest in their country's past. Longfellow's romanticism is disciplined by classicism. The tone of his poetry is didactic. The moralizing tone and that of Christian ethics are reflected in the tone of his poems. A psalm of life, fight on others' sorrow too, and sorrow must end. Longfellow's poetry expresses a sharply defined set of human values: homely affection, simple piety, sensitiveness to beauty, and above all, a refinement of thought and manners. He was one of the truest poets and one of the most accomplished artists America has produced. Section. Other poets. Para. John Greenleaf Whittier, Whittier, 1807 to 1892, was an abolitionist who published his anti-slavery tract, Justice and Expediency, in 1833. He was influenced by Robert Burns. His poems were published in many volumes. Ballads and Other Poems, 1844, Voices of Freedom, 1846, Songs of Labor, 1850, The Chapel of Hermits, 1853, The Panoramas and Other Poems, 1856, Poems and Lyrics 1860 Stop, page 413. The Tent on the Beach 1867, Among the Hills and the Pennsylvanian Pilgrim 1872. His famous themes are nature, humanity, love, tolerance, and justice. Para. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Holmes, 1809 to 1894, was a poet, novelist, biographer, essayist, scientist, and teacher. Many of his poems appeared in the Atlantic. He has a close affinity with English neoclassical poets like Dryden and Pope. As a classical, Holmes reveals a love of order and clarity and common sense. A sense of humor and subdued sentimentalism appears in his family reminiscences. My Aunt, Dorothy Q. and the Last Leaf. Para. James Russell Lowell, 1819 to 1891, was a talented poet and writer. He was profoundly stirred by the tragedy of civil war, which roused him to write Biglow, Biglow Papers, 1867. He contributed a number of deeply thoughtful articles on the topics of the times to the Atlantic Review and the North American Review. His poems appeared in A Year's Life and Other Poems, 1841, Poems, 1844. In 1848, he brought out a 2-volume edition of his poems, A Fable for Critics. Para. As a poet, Lowell was influenced English romantic poets, especially Keats. His contribution to literature consists of criticism and poetry. His critical works among My Books and My Study Windows were influenced by Goethe and Coleridge. Quote, in the sheer enjoyment of literature, hearty, robust, and at any rate with regard to writers of the past open-minded, Lowell has only such men as Lamb and Hazlitt for equals, and he has no superiors. Stop, unquote. Prose. Prose in American literature of the 19th century is closely related with the rise of journalism. The Boston News, the first American newspaper, appeared in 1704, and soon a number of periodicals came into existence. The rise of journalism showed people's growing interest in cultural and literary affairs. The prose of Swift and Defoe and the 18th century essays had its effect on American literature of this period. The Tatler and the Spectator, the famous periodicals of Steele and Addison, inspired the rise of the periodical essays like the Telltale series written by a group of Harvard, Harkard students. I think it should be Harvard students. America was under the sway of reason. Para. The writing of voyages, promotion tracts, sermons, biographies, and histories, which dominated the literary scene of the previous generations, were gradually vanishing. It was an era dominated by the intense feeling of nationalism. Biographies of national leaders were written. The political crisis that confronted America produced a spate of polemical writings in the nature of debate between Whigs and Tories. Pamphlets, speeches, and state papers abundantly appeared. Samuel Adams, James Hollis, John Dickinson, Hamilton, and Jefferson represented the Whigs, whereas Jonathan Bondur, Bondur, Martin Howard, and Samuel Seabury, Seabury, represented the Tories. The polemical writings are remarkable for clarity and political reasoning. American prose style was in the making. Thomas Paine, a propagandist writer, contributed to the development of prose. Declaration of Independence, a specimen of the rhetorical style, is a superb classic as far as clarity of expression, effectiveness of phrases, and fine balance of emotion and reason are concerned. Para. The diaries Woolman and Bradford were the forerunners of autobiography writing. The diarists, D-I-A-R-I-S-T-S, Woolman, W-O-O-L-M-A-N, and Bradford, B-R-A-D-F-O-R-D, were the forerunners of autobiography writing. The essay became a popular literary genre during this period. Stop. By 1722, Franklin imitated the Spectator in Silence de Good. Stop. Soon every newspaper started publishing a series of essays on various subjects. Arthur Bryant wrote in his famous essay, The Art of the Essayist, that essay must look, quote, as if someone has been doing it himself, unquote. Stop. It mirrored the essayist's personality. Washington Irving's IRVING' sketchbook was a distinctive triumph of essay. Like American essay, criticism in America was a byproduct of journalism. Poe and Bryant were pioneers in this field. Para. Cotton Mather, M-A-T-H-E-R, is an early writer of ecclesiastical prose. He copied the writers of the Restoration and the 18th century in England and the rhetoricians of 1630 or 1640. His political fable, 1692, is in lucid prose, and Christian Philosophers, 1721, a tract on Christianity, is conspicuous or flowery style loaded with quotations and allusions. Stop. Essays to Do Good, 1710, which attracted Benjamin Franklin, is written in simple and easy style. Para. Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, written in simple and direct style, fixed, quote, the mode which most realistic autobiographers have since then followed, unquote. Stop. Poor Richard's Almanac is a storehouse of fine, effective, and memorable proverbs, as, quote, the cat in gloves catches no mouse, unquote. Stop. Franklin's little prose pieces like the Whistle, the Ephemera, etc. anticipate the happening of the personal essay and the short story. Page 414. Rules by which a great empire may be reduced, an edict of the King of Russia, contain bitter, sarcastic, and pungent criticism of British Empire, which reminds us of Swiftian irony and sarcasm. Franklin was a celebrated writer of his time. He claimed, quote, prose writing was a principal means of my advancement, unquote. Stop. Para. John Woolman's 1720 to 1770, A Word of Remembrance and Caution to the Rich, and Wilson's 1766 to 1813 American Anthology deserve mention. Michael Guillaume, G-U-I-L-L-A-U-M-E, Jean de Gris, O-U-E-R, 1735 to 1813, the Frenchman and the naturalized citizen of America, wrote letters from an American farmer, 1782, which reflect the tendencies of the ages. These letters contain the germs of three literary forms: the essay, the short story, and the dramatic dialogue. Para. Thomas Paine, 1737 to 1809, wrote The Age of Reason, 2 volumes, 1794 and 1795 respectively, and a number of pamphlets, Common Seas, The American Crisis, and many others. He expressed in simple, clear, and straightforward style views which effected vast changes in political, social, and religious constitution of Western civilization. His prose is persuasive and passionate. Para. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, who became the third President of America, left his mark on both politics and literature. His Declaration of Independence is a classic in prose. His Notes on the State of Virginia, 1784, is a series of informal essays on disputed questions in philosophy, science, politics, and morals. Para. Alexander Hamilton, 1757 to 1804, is remembered for The Federalist, which Jefferson called, quote, the best commentary on the principles of government that ever was written, stop, unquote. It is noticeable for its rationality and convincing, argumentative and lucid style. John Adams, in Thought on Government, 1776, expounded his views on the specific virtues found in the self-government. Madison set a high standard for political reporting. He contributed, quote, a practical demonstration of superior journalism in the unique service he performed by reporting the Constitutional Convention, unquote, stop. He set a high standard for political journalism, which is conspicuous for honesty, patience, and comprehension. Indeed, Jefferson, Madison, John Adams, and Hamilton are the first four statesmen of the Republic. Para. William Hickling, Hickling, Prescott, Prescott, a versatile writer, contributed well-written critics of English literature to the North American Review. His four major works are A History of the Reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, 1837, A History of the Conquest of Mexico, 1843, A History of the Conquest of Peru, 1847, and A History of the Reign of Philip II, 1855 to 88, incomplete at his death. His historical writings are noticeable for unity of theme, dramatic arrangement of striking facts, and elaborate attention to the characterization of leading personalities. Prescott's style was influenced by 18th century English writers and hence is conspicuous for clarity and lucidity, use of balance, antithesis, and metaphor, and it's a printing mistake from low diction. Allytension, Alytention, but I think there's a mistake. Metaphor and allytension from, quote, low diction, unquote, stop. He belligerently insisted on writing English, not American. Drama. The growth of American theatre was hindered by legal statute, contempt of the press, yellow fever, copyright bogie, and the exigencies of war. The theatre was dismissed as, quote, the house of the devil, unquote. No attempts could completely suppress the spirit of dramatic entertainment. It was renewed during the Revolutionary War, and at the end of the 18th century, the American theatre was firmly established. About 1750 plays were produced in the theatres in the South and the Middle colonies, but they were not American plays. They were mostly royalty-free. English plays in Richard II, Dryden's Amphitryon, Amphitryon, Farquhar's Beaux, Beaux', Stratagem, and Addison's Cato, Cato, stop, para. American theatre was strengthened after the Revolution. The first American play was produced at the New Theatre, Philadelphia, America, on April 24, 1767. Thomas Jeffries, The Prince of Parthians, published in 1765. It was a good play which was influenced by Shakespeare and Beaumont and Fletcher. Its theme was Oriental. Mrs. Mercy Warren's The Adulator, 1773, and Blockhead, played in Boston in 1776-77, are not of high quality and deserve passing reference. Para. Roy Tyler's The Contrast, the first American comedy, was staged at the John Street Theatre in New York on April 16, 1787. It is an, quote, excellent acting play, unquote, comma, based on the theme of, quote, urban sophistication versus rural naivety, unquote, stop. It is the first American play which is, quote, the celebration of American character, unquote, and abounds in local references. Para. James Nelson Barker's Tears and Smiles, a sentimental comedy, was a moderate success. His next play, The Embargo, acted in 1808, is in the nature of political discussion. Page 415. His Indian Princess, 1808, is the first Indian play written by an American. It is a melodrama with music and masque, masque. His masterpiece, Superstition, acted in 1824, is, quote, a carefully wrought WROUGHT drama based on an aspect of the regicide judge's story, comma, a very creditable early treatment of a theme later used by Cooper, comma, Hawthorne, comma, Paulding, comma, Longfellow and others, stop, unquote. Barker was, quote, a proponent of an American theatre, stop, unquote, para. William Dunlop, a man of versatile genius and achievements, exerted, quote, an influence which helped to elevate and stabilize the theatre in a chaotic period, unquote, stop. Although he lacked an imaginative power of the first order, he rendered memorable service to American drama by providing, quote, standards of taste and technique, unquote, stop. His first play, The Father or American Shandyism, acted in 1789, was not a distinguished work. The Italian Father, acted 1799, comma, Andres 1798, comma, a tragedy, and The Glory of Columbia, a commercial success, memorable for dramatic craftsmanship. Dunlop's History of American Theatre, 1832, is a monumental work. He contributed much to the welfare of American theatre and drama.